We're here to talk about practicing personal closure. And hopefully by the end of this video, not only will you be able to understand it and practice it for yourself, but you'll also be able to communicate the need for practicing personal closure and equip others to do so as well. So firstly, we want to look at what is personal closure and how do we practice it? So the first question is, what is personal closure? And closure is a term that's often used in mission circles to refer to the practice of closing the door to a phase of ministry before opening the next one. But this practice can also be used to close a season, or if we're transitioning roles, or after critical events in our lives, such as disappointments, failures, a loss of vision, etc. As we can see in the picture on the screen is this man who's walking his journey of life. And as he goes on, he acquires boulder on top of boulder on top of boulder. And this photo really just represents the load that accumulates as we continue in our life's journey. And this load can come from conflict, stress, worry, frustrations, fears, change, carrying other people for seasons. It can be good experiences, challenging experiences, or negative experiences that add to the load. So the idea behind practicing personal closure is to just kind of taking time to actually step out from under the load and examine what's there and what we can leave behind and what we need to continue forward with. It is a similar concept to debrief, but when we practice personal closure, it happens more frequently than debrief. And it's first and foremost between you and the Lord. Now, others can be involved in this process, but God is at the core of it. And only He is able to turn difficult situations into good. Our greatest resource in practicing personal closure is our ability to get God's perspective and draw upon His resources to face ourselves and our circumstances. Again, our goal is not only to learn how to practice this for ourselves, but also how we can help others practice personal closure. We can see in Jeremiah 17, verses 7 and 8, that God says, "Blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in Him. He will be like a tree planted by the water that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought and never fails to bear fruit." I think we all probably have a testimony or two of a challenging time period where we really drew refreshment and strength and energy from the Lord. And this verse reminds us, gives us that picture of a tree that when it needs water, it sends its roots out seeking the water. And so it's a good reminder for us that no matter our circumstances, especially in those challenging times, that we can actually stretch out our roots in God to get the nourishment we need so that we can continue on. It is as we consistently practice personal closure that we develop the staying power we need to keep going in His service. So why is it necessary to practice personal closure? Well, to explore this question, let's look at a case study, a story about a woman named Barbara. Barbara had been sent out by her church with good support and had many friends that were praying for her. But in her 6th year, her church began experiencing internal problems. She prayed for them, and as a personal friend to the pastor and his wife, stayed in good communication. However, after 6 months of struggle, the church split. She received an official letter expressing regret that they could no longer support her in missions. She was extremely disappointed in the church and her friends that were involved on both sides of the split. But she was even struggling with God. Couldn't He have prevented this? Besides that, she was left with almost no support. What do you think are some of the potential immediate consequences of her disappointment? It could be physical, emotional, spiritual, relational, financial. Maybe it's broken trust with the church. a loss of finances, a crisis of faith? What are some potential consequences in 5 years if she goes on without bringing closure or getting help with this disappointment? Maybe there are false beliefs that take root from this experience, such as a poverty mentality. Maybe she begins to struggle with depression, or maybe there's a bitterness against God. What are some potential consequences on her team? It's important to note that the burdens that we carry, our load that we carry, invariably will impact those around us. Maybe her team begins to feel a need to fill the gap of support for her. Maybe they take on her offense against the church. Or maybe there are teammates that begin to question God's faithfulness and provision. So we see that there is a need for Barbara to really face this disappointment. And practicing personal closure really equips us and enables us to face the reality of our circumstances. However, there are 5 common reasons we don't practice personal closure. Mainly, we can be unaware of the need. We're too busy to see it. Life is full and it's constant, and it doesn't give us much space to breathe, much less to see what we're actually carrying, how it's actually affecting us. Another is that we've normalized the load. It's become comfortable. It's what we know. Maybe it's even become part of our identity or how we get our worth by the burden that we're carrying. Or maybe it's created a victim mentality, and to really let it down and explore it would mean to explore that we actually have some responsibilities and ownership in the burdens that we've carried. Or maybe we just don't know how. Maybe no one's modeled it for us or taught us about it. Maybe we just need permission to stop. We didn't know we could do this. Another reason is that we've become too dependent on others. While we do need others, our first and foremost resource is God. And if we're not careful, if we're too dependent on others, we can begin to believe that nobody cares, or nobody wants to really listen and hear how we're going. No one really wants to help, and it can lead us to feel isolated or stranded. And lastly, our pride can actually prevent us from practicing personal closure. Maybe it's denying the need for personal closure because it would mean acknowledging a loss of hope or health or a loss of capacity. Maybe we'll actually feel weak or not enough. But whatever the reason for why we don't do it, the reality is we need it. It helps us to continue well. So how do we practice personal closure? Well, there are these 5 G's, if you will, that gives the 5 different steps for really practicing personal closure. The first thing we want to do is we want to grieve what's been lost. And to do that, we first really have to identify the losses, what has been lost. We might need to go back in our story to see what has happened. What were some of the changes we experienced, or the concerns and criticisms or conflicts that happened, or maybe even a crisis? What has been lost in this past season or phase? Then once we've identified the losses, we want to really face the pain of that loss. Grief is really giving value to what's been lost. It's really acknowledging the value of what's been lost. And so when we face the pain, we're allowing our heart to really grieve those things. So we've identified the losses and we're facing the pain, and we want to embrace the loss. We want to face the reality of what life is now with this included, this loss included. Maybe it's a loss of friendship, or a loss of reputation, a loss of vision, a loss of role or identity. Just really embracing what has been lost so that you can face the full truth of your experiences and how it's impacted you. And we want to learn how to be prepared to go on without it. Again, this can't really happen well without the Lord. We know that every loss creates a set of needs. And so there are some needs that we're going to be dependent on God to fill once a loss happens. And maybe he's going to fill it immediately, or maybe he's going to say, you're just going to need to trust me, and it will happen down the road. So we need to learn how to be prepared to go on with this loss included in our lives. Next, we want to get rid of rubbish. So this is really kind of a sanctifying phase. We want to really acknowledge and identify those disappointments and resentments, angerness or bitterness that has come up, any unforgiveness that we might still have. We want to really acknowledge what's there and pour out our heart before the Lord, much like David did repeatedly in the Psalms. We also want to ask for the Lord's discernment to identify lies from the enemy, or maybe some false beliefs that have taken root because of our experiences. And we want to get rid of those wrong thoughts or attitudes that we have about God, or about our leaders or church, about people groups or organization, about ourselves. We really want to allow God to renew our minds and our hearts, and to speak truth in his perspective into our hearts. And we want to take ownership of our part in what has happened, of how we handled things, good or bad. Others may have been involved, but we have a part that we've played. We are responsible for how we respond. And lastly, we want to invite God into this process. We want to invite him into the decluttering of our baggage, of our load. And we want to know, who do I still need to forgive? What do I need to do in order to be able to forgive? Now, we know that not everything we experience is terrible. Not everything we experience is challenging and negative. And it's important that we do this next step of gathering the lessons and the memories, the things we want to hold on to and carry with us in the future. So we want to know, what lessons have we learned from this? Where have I grown in this past season? What are the moments I'm proud of? What positive memories can you store up? In Romans 8:28, Paul says, and we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. So you can seek the Lord to see what is the good from this past phase or season. Next, we really want to guard the door to the past. Now that we've identified the losses and we've grieved and we've gotten rid of the rubbish, we want to keep what we're leaving behind us. So we want, once you've dealt with something, leave it in the past. This is that same principle of, once you've forgiven someone of something, then you don't use that event against them in the future. It's in the past now. Now, sometimes we do need to reprocess events, or maybe recall lessons, or share specific stories from the past with someone. And that's fine. But the goal in this is that we don't dwell in the negativity. We don't dwell in the resentment or the bitterness of what happened. But we process that through, and we get to the point where we can move forward without it, without the resentment hanging on. And it can be really helpful to do something symbolic to remind you that that season is over and the door is closed. Maybe it's, writing on scraps of paper the things that you're leaving in the past and then burning it. And of course, lastly, we want to get ready for the future. Hebrews 12:1 says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us." The purpose of personal closure is to help us run the race that God has set out for us unhindered. So to get ready for the future, we want to determine to speak humbly and honestly about the past. We want to be honest, but we also want to be speaking life. We don't want to speak death and only negativity about that season. We also may need to recommit to trusting God for the future and embrace it, embracing the journey. So in order for us to practice personal closure well, there are 5 elements that are needed: awareness, faith, time, humility, and commitment. We need to be aware of the need to practice personal closure. We need to have faith that God really brings about his purposes and plans. He redeems situations, and he has our best in mind. Humility to acknowledge our limited perspective, acknowledge that I'm also a sinner, and allow God's perspective to come in. And that we set aside time to do this, to practice personal closure. We take initiative to create the habit of practicing personal closure. And commitment, committing to the process, as well as committing enough to make it a priority. Now, this does come with a warning because balance is needed. Practicing personal closure is not encouraging independence or isolation. It's often helpful to process with someone, either while you're processing with the Lord or after you've finished doing all of these steps with the Lord. But we categorize practicing personal closure under Savior care because first and foremost, it is going to the Lord as your resource for continuing well. Now, some will find the process of closure comes easily, but others may really struggle. If you or someone you know have been wrestling with a difficult issue for some time and just can't seem to get past it, then it may be good to bring in another leader or a professional counselor. And some traumatic events and experiences can be so emotionally damaging that we need other people's experiences in order to help us process. So we're not saying you can't talk to anyone else while you're practicing personal closure, but it's just acknowledging our first resource is the Lord. So to wrap up, here are some reflection questions. First, how would you rate your own practice of personal closure? Have you ever heard of this? Have you ever tried it? Maybe you've done some of these steps naturally without ever hearing this. How would you explain this practice to Barbara? If we went back to the story at the beginning, Barbara, whose church split up and she lost most of her support. How would you explain this practice to her? How would you communicate the need for it and then the practical application of it? And that might help you with the next question, which is how can you apply this to helping others? And lastly, what key points do you want to remember from this lesson? So I hope that helped clarify for you just what is practicing personal closure, how you can do it, and also how you can help others do it as well. So along with this video and your resources, you'll find a document called Practicing Personal Closure, Biblical Examples. And in this chart, we can see different examples of people in the Bible in moments when practicing personal closure could really help them. So feel free to take a look at that to get a few more examples of practicing personal closure and why it can be helpful for us to carry on well. So that wraps up our teaching on practicing personal closure. I hope this has been helpful. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. Bye.